Good morning. And good morning, all. I'm just going to wait a few minutes for everybody to be allowed in or to join the seminar here. Okay, I think I'll slowly get started and welcome everybody to the International Macro History Online Seminar Series. I see many familiar names and happy to see everybody here. This morning we're going to be lucky enough to have Howard Bodenhorn speak to us. But before I introduce him, let me just wait a few more minutes as folks are still coming in. Okay. So I should have said that my name is Angela Redish, and I'm from the University of British Columbia. And so I'll say good morning to you all, but I know for many it's afternoon or evening. So as appropriate, good afternoon, good evening. As I said, happy to have Howard Bodenhorn speak to us this morning. He's a professor at Clemson University and a member of the NBER Research Associate at the NBER. And this morning he's going to speak to us on a subject on which I thought he had already written everything that was to be written. So, but no, we're going to hear more about early American banknotes, and in particular, the extent of the market for early American banknotes. So with that, let me just remind you, and I'm sure most of you know kind of the rules of engagement. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A. Don't raise your hand, just put your question in the Q&A. I'll sort of save the questions for the end and then ask them. If you have a clarification question, put hashtag clarification in your Q&A, so I see that it's to be asked during the seminar, but otherwise hold your questions till the end, please. And yes, I think that's it. So with nothing further, Howard, early American banknotes.
Good morning, everybody, or good after. I guess it is afternoon, actually, here in Clemson. All right, so Angela's already given you the title of the paper. I'm looking at. I'm asking the question: how far did banknotes travel in the early part of in the first half of the 19th century? This is a question that I have been thinking about, as Angela says, for a very long time. You'd like to think that you've written, I've written an awful lot, but my desire to write this paper actually opened up about 30 years ago when Gary Gorton was a young assistant professor at Wharton and came to Rutgers and gave an early talk on what eventually became his JPE article on the pricing of early American banknotes. And one of the questions that was raised in the seminar that he was unable to answer is, how far did these banknotes actually travel, right? Because he had prices in Philadelphia of banknotes that were from all over the country, and the question was raised, are these actually transaction prices, and do these banknotes from far-flung places like Michigan and Tennessee, did they actually show up in Philadelphia? It took me many years to actually find the data to address this question, and I finally did a couple of years ago. And so this is the result of a long process of trying to answer this question. All right, so the question is, how far did antebellum banknotes travel? Contemporaries If you believe contemporary accounts, the answer is not very far. Richard Hildreth wrote that um, in 1840 that a Boston banknote passes in all commercial transactions, the same as coin, but a Philadelphia banknote does not pass at Boston, which means local merchants would not accept a Philadelphia banknote. And then this famous quote from William Lowndes to John C. Calhoun, both of whom are from South Carolina, so that's kind of close to home here, recounted this story about leaving Washington, D.C. and going to visit in Kentucky and Tennessee. And he recounted that every time he basically traveled about 50 miles, he had to exchange the money he had picked up the previous day for the money that was going to be used locally, right? So as he moved from Virginia to Tennessee, he had to change his Virginia notes into Tennessee notes, and he went back to Kentucky, he had to change them back into Kentucky notes. And the quote continues to go on that he had to change his Kentucky money back into Virginia money when he got back in Virginia as part of the round trip, right? So the implication there is that the notes didn't travel very far. So the question really is, why would we care about this? And I think the answer is about Smithy and growth. So the principal question is, how widely will private currencies circulate when there's costly verification and transaction costs, right? So in a historical context, again, this is an important question because for economies to start to grow, they need to monetize. And as Smith pointed out, that monetization is going to lead to trade, which leads to specialization and division of labor. And all this leads to Smithian growth, which is a precursor for modernization. The other reason that this is an interesting question is that Philip Kagan, way back in 1963, excuse me, wrote an article in which he doubted whether the United States would have grown as quickly as it did in the late 19th century if it had relied on the private currencies that were issued in the early 19th century. And so it also goes to addressing that sort of longstanding question. There are existing studies out there on banknote pricing. Gorton's 1996 paper in the JPE, and then Jaremski revisited this in 2011 in the Journal of Economic History article. And what both of them do effectively is they use the reported prices of banknotes in Philadelphia, and then they regress these on various sort of factors to try to understand how banknotes were priced. Gary focused primarily on travel costs and travel time because he spent a lot of time recreating how long it would take to travel from various points to Philadelphia using the principal modes of transportation, either steamboats, railroads, carriages, and whatnot. Matt's paper in 2011 took this a step further. He did something similar with time cost, but then he also included a lot of balance sheet information from the banks to understand how prices would be, how leverage and capitalization and so forth would also be reflected in these prices, and were they responding in ways that we would think that prices would respond to, risks and fundamentals, right? My concern with both of these studies is that, again, we don't know that a lot of these prices in Philadelphia were actually transaction prices. And the question then arises, right, in finance, how do you have price discovery in assets that are rarely traded, right? So, I mean, there's a great deal of information about the prices that banknote brokers were willing to pay for these notes, but we don't know that they actually encountered any of these notes and actually had to buy them at the quoted prices, right? So my paper is trying to answer the question, how wide is the circle around which these prices might be transactions prices? So the quick preview, because sometimes you don't get to the end, basically says what I find is that encountering a banknote that was issued as little as 50 miles away was basically a 50-50 proposition. Beyond 50 miles, the probability of observing a banknote declines quite rapidly beyond that point. which also accords with what we know about pricing because the average discount on a 50-mile distant banknote was about 2/3 of 1%, and the median discount was zero, right? So basically, I think what this tells us is that individuals tended to encounter notes that were issued relatively close to where they lived. They were probably familiar with them. The verification costs were low. And so they basically satisfy this no questions asked criteria that Gorton sets out as paper, is that what makes a currency a valuable medium of exchange is that people will accept it without asking, without inquiring about its value. Okay. All right, so again, here's the sort of preview, the empirical preview of the main result, which is you can see that this is just the problem. On the vertical axis is the probability of receiving any dollar value of banknotes from a bank. And then on the horizontal axis is the miles between issuing and receiving banks. And you can see that at about 50 miles, what you're looking at there is about a 50% probability of receiving these notes. And you can see that it tails off. By the time you get 200 miles out, it's well below a 10% probability and approaching about a 5% probability of receiving a distant banknote. Okay. All right. So in the modern world, there have been some statisticians actually who have looked at this. And what they use is this really cool website called Where in the World is George? And what people will do is that they'll stamp a $1 banknote and they write down, and it has a link to this, or it directs you to this website where you can enter the serial number on the banknote and you can look it up and it'll tell you where other people have been, where this note has been, where other people have logged into the site and identified that this note was there. So Brockman and a couple of colleagues have they downloaded about 1 million observations from this website to understand how modern Federal Reserve banknotes travel across the United States. And what the map there kind of shows, they look at a handful of cities: Jacksonville, Florida, New York City, Seattle, Washington, and then they trace out how these banknotes travel across time. And basically what they show is that it follows an inverse power law distribution. In other words, the distance that a banknote travels within a short period of time, and I think they use a 10-day interval, declines incredibly rapidly, right? So it follows this distribution that I have up on the screen. And that basically what this graph shows you is that it's following something that's very, very close to an inverse power law distribution here too, right? So it appears that banknotes then and banknotes now have similar characteristics in terms of how far they actually travel. Okay. I've been working on this for a long time. I've been thinking about this for a long time. So all this seems like everybody should know it, but for those of you who don't, are not familiar with what's going on here. So in the early United States, there was no Federal Reserve. There was this first and second banks of the United States that issued notes, but most of the currency that got used was issued by individual banks. As Angela has talked about in some of her papers, the coinage in early America was pretty bad, right? And so you needed something that was a little bit more reliable and easier to use than weighing out every coin that you took in. And so banknotes sort of filled that role. So you can think of banknotes as being effectively privately issued, small denomination, non-interest bearing debt obligations of the issuing banks. Banks were required by law to redeem their notes into legal tender, which was gold and silver, on demand, or face various penalties, including the most severe of which was a revocation of their charters. Because they were privately issued currencies, note holders faced potential losses. But as you can imagine, monitoring was uneconomic for most holders of a few dollars worth of banknotes. So there was probably very little sort of individual level monitoring that took place. There were several public and private monitoring and redemption systems that developed during this time to solve that problem. The Suffolk system in New England, the mandatory redemption agent program in New York City. But what most banks did was that they would form informal relationships with city banks who would agree to accept their notes at par and then send them back, and they had to maintain correspondent accounts. The market-based system is a fascinating tale of these private banknote brokers who set up shop and would stand willing to buy notes issued by distant banks at some price, right? Uh, some of the more successful banknote brokers would actually they would actually publish newspapers either on a weekly or biweekly basis where they would publish the going rate at which they would accept these banknotes. And their papers usually included other information like stock prices, the prices of various goods that traded in the market at the time, shipping news, things like that, right? So they were sort of all-purpose business newspapers that also had these detailed account reports of what they would be willing to pay for banknotes. All right. One of the most famous ones is Van Court's counterfeit detector and banknote list. He published this in Philadelphia from about 1840 to the Civil War. It came out every week, right? Or is it, no, his was monthly. His came out once a month. And this is what a piece of a column out of Van Court's would look like, right? So these are three banks in central Pennsylvania, two in Lancaster, which is about 50 miles west of Philadelphia, and Lebanon, which is about 60 to 70 miles sort of northwest of Philadelphia. Basically, all of them, what it tells you is that each one of their notes traded at par inside the city of Philadelphia, or at least he would accept them at par. It gives you the name of the cashier. And then what's interesting is that they would list every known counterfeit of these banks' notes, right? So the Lancaster Bank had 5 different known counterfeits of their $5 notes and 2 known counterfeits of their $10 notes and one known counterfeit of their $50 notes, right? You can see the same thing for the Lancaster Bank and the Lebanon Bank. And some of the descriptions of the counterfeits are quite detailed. So these newspapers were designed to provide potential note acceptors, if you will, a great deal of information about the quality of these notes, and would tell you about which counterfeits, which ones were more likely to be counterfeits that you should be on the lookout for. These were subscription-based newspapers. Local merchants would purchase these if they expected to receive a large number of these banknotes as part of their ongoing business. And so if they come across a customer walks into their store or whatever, offers them an unfamiliar banknote, they could turn to this source and look it up and see what the going price was in Philadelphia. And then it would also give them some information about the quality of the bank, whether or not the banknote they're about to accept was a counterfeit or not. So this is just a plot of the banknote discounts by distance from Philadelphia. And you can see that, so Van Courts appears to have priced his notes that were within about 80 miles. So the vertical line is 80 miles, and that's about the distance between both New York and Baltimore. We'll come back to that, the importance of that in a few minutes. And you can see most of the notes within that 80-mile radius are going to, he's willing to purchase them at basically par, right? There's a 0 discount on those notes. Once you get outside that 80-mile distance, you can see that the discounts increase, and some of them, I mean, they increase clearly non-linearly in distance. There is a group that trades at about 2.5%. There's a group that trades at about 5%, a much smaller group that trades at about 10%. And then you can see there's these handful of banks that are trading at about 20%. So again, so how do you interpret this graph? So the 2.5% would say if you offered some merchant, or you offered Van Court's $100 worth of a bank's notes that was roughly 100 miles away, that he would pay you $97.50 for those notes, right? So that's how the discount pricing works in that case. So how have people thought about modeling this? So Gary Gorton in -- derives a very elaborate formal model using the Black-Scholes option pricing formula. You just treat this as non-interest bearing debt. And so you just, use this formula because it's how you would price debt with various redemption dates, right? And so the implications that drop out of this very quickly are that the price of notes varies inversely with distance to the issuing bank and leverage. Uh, what's not true is that all notes that are a given distance from the bank will not necessarily trade at the same price, because they'll have different risk characteristics. But the second element that comes out of his theory is that there's this no arbitrage condition, which implies that the notes that are issued by all the banks at a given location will have to trade at the same price, right? So you can't have two banks that are across the street from one another that would trade at different prices, because people could easily arbitrage on that price differential just by taking the notes of one bank and walking across the street to the other and demanding currency, right? All the banks at a given location will trade at the same price, but not every bank at a given distance will trade at the same price. Consumers have some preference for both home goods and distant goods. And so most consumers are going to face a cash in advance constraint, which means, they're going to have to pay for their goods up front. And they have to travel to purchase some of these goods. But what they have to take into account is that they travel further away from the issuing bank to buy these preferred goods, provided it sold or produced in a distant market, that the value of their currency is going to decline. And so they're going to have to take this into consideration in their optimization decision. And so there's going to be some critical distance beyond which a bank's notes will not serve as an effective medium of exchange. The discount effectively gets too high, that it makes the price of buying distant goods too expensive relative to home goods. And so you'll not buy the goods produced at a distance, right? So again, it's a very nice formal model of what's going on, but I think it misses an important point, right? So graphically, I don't want to spend much time on this. This is basically designed to show, if you think Gary's model is about, you can think about the world as a series of concentric rings, and it moves out, right? And so you can see within this first ring, not every bank at that distance is going to trade at the same price, but as you get further away, the discount should increase because information costs increase, transportation costs increase, those sorts of things, right? So my concern about the paper, Barry's paper and Matt's paper, is that treating the world as a featureless plane, which we know it's not. And the second concern is that again, gets to this question of how far did banknotes travel? So I think in order to really understand this market, you need to think about how trade flowed, right? And so in the United States in the first half of the 19th century, most of the goods that are flowing from west to east are going to be primary products, are going to be agricultural goods and primary products like lumber and potash and things like this. Westbound goods are going to be mostly manufactured goods that are either going to be coming from Europe or from the East Coast cities. Neither one of these flows are facilitated or financed with banknotes. What people use to finance the movement of these goods were inland bills of exchange, right? So people are not taking thousands of dollars worth of Philadelphia banknotes and going off to the hinterlands and buying wheat and then bringing it back. They're going and borrowing money at a local bank in upstate New York and buying the wheat, putting it on a ship or a boat to take down the Erie Canal, and then they sell it in New York, right? And so banknotes are not used in those kinds of transactions. What's going to be true is that travelers are going to carry small amounts of banknotes when they travel, right? So, and again, if you're only traveling a short distance, you might use banknotes to engage in those transactions, but you're not going to use banknotes to travel hundreds of miles to engage in those types of, at least in those types of wholesale transactions, right? People might carry pocketfuls of local notes to engage in small scale transactions, kind of like Lowndes' story about his travels through Virginia and Kentucky and Tennessee. He had to buy breakfast, he had to pay for hotel rooms, all that sort of stuff. But he wasn't doing any sort of wholesale trade with banknotes in his pocket, right? And so this is basically how I mean, after looking through this, this would be a slightly different formulation of the Gorton model. So you think about a concentric circle around Philadelphia, right? These banks in Lebanon and Lancaster and York and so forth are going to be trading with Philadelphia. And so you can see there'll be banknotes moving back and forth between those those banks in Lebanon and Lancaster. And there'll also be notes moving from further west, right? From places like Pittsburgh is going to be trading with Philadelphia along the main line canal. Buffalo is going to be trading with New York City. Oh, sorry. York, Pennsylvania is going to be trading largely with Baltimore because it's going to be moving down the Susquehanna River to Baltimore. And so the map on the left there is just showing you the principal rivers and the principal canals along which most of these goods are going to be moving. And this is how trade is going to flow, right? And so you can see that along the Erie Canal, right? Here's the New York City story, here's the Philadelphia story, and here's the Baltimore story. And they're going to be notes should be moving along these trade routes. They're not going to be just scattered. They're not going to be just moving randomly across the United States. All right. Okay. That said, so where does the data come from? The data comes from two reports that the Pennsylvania Auditor General collected. So he was the person who supervised Pennsylvania banks in the first half of the 19th century. In March of 1842, Philadelphia, a small isolated bank run breaks out in Philadelphia City. In response to that bank run, the legislature asked the Auditor General to solicit detailed bank balance sheets from all the banks in the state to I think they were trying to understand the source of the run and the effect that it had on the banks themselves. And the Auditor General asked for all the usual balance sheet information that banks would report, but what he also asked for was detailed information on every banknote that the banks held, and every interbank deposit that they either had with a different bank or held for a different bank 2 weeks prior to the run. Okay. There were 42 banks in Pennsylvania at the time. 37 of them responded to the call. I have no idea what happened to the other 5, but only 17 of these banks provided really detailed information on their note holdings. They literally would list every bank, the notes of every bank, and the dollar value of notes held on that bank. Okay, even though it's only a small group of banks that reported, it looks like a reasonably representative sample of banks. There's a large number of Philadelphia banks, there's Pittsburgh banks, and then there are banks from what you would think of as the major regional trading centers within sort of in the hinterlands of Pennsylvania, places like Easton, Lancaster, York, Lebanon, Harrisburg, and so forth, right? So these were sort of local market cities where these banks were located, and so they're reporting. It looks like a reasonably representative sample. Okay. So this is, again, for those of you who are not familiar with what these bank balance sheets look like. On the right-hand side, you can see sort of a standard liability section of the balance sheet. It has capital stock, notes in circulation, bad loan account due to other banks. So this particular bank, the Eastern Bank of Pennsylvania, held accounts with just 4 other banks, 2 of them in New Jersey, 3 of them in New Jersey, and 1 of them is Pittsburgh. You can see the amount of their discounts, net loans they made to other people, deposits, and so forth, right? On the left-hand side this is the detailed list of due from other banks. Okay, so this is accounts that the Eastern Bank holds in other banks. And you can see it's New York City, not much in Boston, quite a bit in Philadelphia, some in Trenton, and so forth, right? And then this is what their listing of this is just a partial listing of the banknotes that they held from other banks and throughout the rest of the United States, right? And so one of the things that jumps out to me immediately is that almost all of these are from Pennsylvania, okay? In addition to the balance sheets, I'm going to use information on the bank's assets, their loans, their specie reserves, the amounts due from other banks, various liabilities, including their leverage ratios, their total circulations, and so forth. Excuse me. I'm going to limit this analysis to just the states that are contiguous to Pennsylvania. An initial survey of these reports showed that Pennsylvania banks held virtually no notes from New England, virtually no notes from the American South, and very few notes from what we would now consider the old Northwest of Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, and so forth, right? So I limit the analysis to these 6 states that are contiguous to Pennsylvania. Just to quickly get through the summary statistics, the average bank had about $150,000 in outstanding banknotes. They held about $86 in other banks' notes, most that's largely driven by the fact there's lots of zeros. They held about they owed other banks about $105. They're about the same, and others. Of the banks that are of the banknotes that are in the sample, there were about 4 known counterfeits. The average distance between the accepting bank and the issuing bank was about 167 miles. You can see that the average bank was also about 16 years old. About 3% of them are on the Susquehanna River, and the other ones, about another 12 or 15% of them, are located on one of the principal canals that touched on Pennsylvania. Okay. So I'll get through that. This is just a graph of notes of other banks held by Philadelphia, I think it's 6 banks in Philadelphia that report. And this is just, so there are 2 things that kind of jump out of this, right? Is that that New York City is not terribly prominent. Pittsburgh is a little bit more prominent than New York City. But you can also see what's interesting is that there's just massive numbers of zeros here, right? So Cincinnati is about the farthest away that there's any reported banknotes at all, right? And it's just barely above 0, right? And so you can see that most of the scatter here is going to be within 100 miles, okay? This is just a histogram of the dollar value of notes accepted. The one on the left includes all the zeros. So you can see that about 85 to 88%, something like that, of all the other banks of these 6 contiguous states, the banks that are, these 17 banks that report, hold exactly 0 of those notes, okay? And then when I drop the zeros and then plot out the histogram for holdings between $1 and $500 in the right-hand panel, you can actually see again something that looks like there's power law distribution that Brockman found for the modern Federal Reserve notes, right? It declines very rapidly in distance, right? The dollar value of notes that you're looking at here, okay? So the empirical approach here is that I'm going to use zero inflated negative binomial regressions to estimate the probability of holding 0 banknotes, right? So in this case, with all those excess zeros, I need to think about how to deal with that. And so this is what the 0 inflated binomial regressions do. What's nice about these models is you can think about 0 as being either strategic or structural. Structural means that 0 is a natural outcome, that in the sense that some banknotes just aren't observed because they don't travel very far. A strategic 0 is observed because a bank may have been presented with one of these banknotes, but then chose not to accept it, okay? And so basically what this procedure does is it does something reasonably close to a Heckman selection model. You estimate a first stage to predict all the zeros, and then you include that in the second stage of a negative binomial regression to actually calculate the probabilities of receiving a banknote, right? I'm not gonna talk about that. Here's the big principal result that's interesting here. So this is the probability of holding $0 of banknotes by miles, right? So you can see that the blue triangles are Philadelphia banks, and the red diamonds are New York City banks. And again, you can see that within Philadelphia, there's only a 30% chance that a Philadelphia bank will not hold the note of another Philadelphia bank at all, right? That's what that 0 here would mean. But once again, you get up to, once you get out to about 80 miles, right, there's basically a very small probability or a very large probability that you're not going to be holding a banknote from that far away, right? And once you get to 250 miles, the estimated effect is 0, right? You're just not going to hold any notes from more than 250 miles away. Let's see. This is, if you think what's driving this is a difference between urban and rural banks. So the red dots are Philadelphia banks. The blue dots are the reporting country banks, the non-Philadelphia banks. You can see that the process looks very similar, regardless of whether about which type of bank, city banks versus country banks that you're looking at. So again, the odds that you're going to hold, the odds that you're not going to observe a note increase very rapidly in distance here. Okay. In 1849, again, the Columbia Bank and Bridge was the only bank that reported the same information. I don't know why they did it. But very quickly, I estimated the same model for them using a much smaller data set. The pattern looks almost identical to that, right? So again, the takeaways from this is that the average discount, the average note that's going to be readily accepted in a transaction is going to be issued by a bank that's less than 50 miles away. The verification costs are small, transactions costs are small, and they're going to satisfy this no questions asked criteria. You have to, so this raises a couple of issues that we want to think about here. I've got 5 minutes left. Are these strategic refusals or structural low likelihoods of encounters? Looking around in other sources, what they seem to be mostly is structural low likelihoods, right? So the State Bank of Indiana, in their reports in the late 1830s, before the panic struck in 1837, reported in a legislative query, were asked which banks would you be willing to accept notes from? And most of them listed banks across the Ohio River Valley. They included Pennsylvania, New York State, New York City, and New England, and New Orleans, and so forth. Most of them said they would refuse the State Bank of Illinois notes, which was a known fairly poorly operated bank, which is not surprising. And then they would also report in sort of a limited way which banknotes they had actually encountered. And it turns out that, so they would be willing to accept banknotes from lots of places, but the banknotes that they actually encountered came from a very limited set of places, right? So they came from places, not surprisingly, like Louisville, Kentucky, and Cincinnati, Ohio, which again are right on the Ohio River. They come from Pittsburgh, also on the Ohio River, New Orleans on the Mississippi River. So these notes are going to be moving up and down these principal trade routes, but they're not seeing very many notes from weird places, right? Like one bank reported that somehow they ended up with $25 worth of South Carolina notes, right? They didn't explain how, they just said this is what happened. Right. So the answer is, I think most of this is not being driven by the fact that a bank refuses to take the notes of some distant bank. They're just not encountering them, right? They're not moving that far, right? The second question is, well, maybe we observe all these zeros because banks got rid of the notes almost as quickly as they took them in. The answer to that response is no. Again, that doesn't seem to be what's happening here. Because again, a lot of these Indiana banks, what they reported was that they would actually hold relatively modest amounts of the notes of other banks, because if they had a customer that walked in and said, well, I'm traveling to Cincinnati or St. Louis and do you have any notes from banks there that I can use once I get there? They would hold small amounts of these notes that they could then give to their customers to facilitate their travel as they moved again up and down the river, as they are taking these goods as wholesalers up and down the river, right? So again, in New York City banks also reported how long they tended to hold on to notes before they would return them for redemption. Most banks reported values between 13 and 30 days, right? So it's not like they got a note on a Tuesday and they got rid of it as quickly as they could on Wednesday morning. They're actually holding onto these notes until they get at least a substantial number of them before they would return them to the issuing bank, or they would take them to a note broker and sell them to a note broker or whatever. Okay. And then so the other thing that got me going on this was that a few years ago, I was at the Baker Library at Harvard, and I was looking for some banking material, and one of the archivists said, well, we have these records of this small-time note broker in Darien, Connecticut from 1850. Would you like to see it? And of course, why not? Yeah, of course, right? So bring it out. And so I photographed all these pages and entered all this information. And so over this time period, we don't know how long it is. It's roughly 1850. I think it's probably about a year. He discounted about 500 notes by 100 that were brought in by about 192 different individuals from 85 banks located in 54 cities, right? The average straight line distance was about 100 miles. And there were more notes from New York City than anywhere else, right? Again, this is what this distribution of banknotes looks like by distance from from this note broker. Obviously, New York City, New Haven, Goshen, New York, Norwalk, Connecticut are going to be driving this result here, right? This is what's this is because Stan, for those of you who are not familiar with where this city is, right? So the black triangle, the black diamond here is where the note broker was located. And then the size of the red circles are where these notes that he's discounting are arriving from. You'll notice that obviously there's a group that comes out of Connecticut right around him there. New York City is the biggest one, but you'll notice there's also a lot of other banks that are situated that they would be trading where their goods would be moving into New York Harbor, and then they would just move into Long Island Sound and they would end up at the bank. You can ask, what's going on with these notes, right? This is the Erie Canal, right? And then it hits the Hudson River and it moves down to New York City, and then it moves across to Stamford, Connecticut, right? What I find interesting is that there were relatively very small numbers of notes that were coming out of New England, right? Most of it is obvious. And when I read some histories about Stamford, Connecticut, it turns out that most of the merchants and so forth in the early 19th century were trading predominantly with merchants in New York City, right? And so you can see that the distribution of banknotes that they're taking in are coming from places like New Haven and Hartford and so forth within Connecticut, but by and large, they're coming from banks that are located along the Erie Canal, New York City, the Morris Canal in New Jersey. These goods are ending up in New York Harbor, and then so they're following the trade routes that bring them to Stamford, Connecticut. All right. So conclusion, I think I hit my time mark here, right? Yeah. So how far did they travel? They traveled primarily within about a 50-mile radius. Within that radius, these verification costs were relatively low. Notes are going to satisfy this no questions asked criteria because the notes within that radius are going to be familiar. The discounts are small, less than 1% on average. And so I guess my conclusion is, contrary to Kagan's argument that these individual or privately issued currencies were imposing a significant cost on transactions and reduce the amount of trade that was taking place, and more in line with Hugh Rockoff's early paper on this, and then Robert King's paper on ex post values of notes, is that these private currencies did not impose substantial costs on the public, and they probably did not impede any significant amount of impersonal exchanges taking place in the United States. So this sort of Smithian growth that we're concerned about in the early 19th century was allowed to take place because the economy was monetizing in a way that actually facilitated transactions. It wasn't standing in the way of transactions. Okay. I think my time is up, so I'll stop there. Okay.
Okay, thank you so much, Howard. That's great. I have lots of questions, and I'm obviously not going to be the only one. But I will, first of all, encourage everyone to put questions in the Q&A, and I see one already, so we'll get to Chris in a minute. And just to say, as I should have said at the beginning, that we'll go for about 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes, then we'll stop the formal part of the seminar. There'll be time for another 15 minutes of questions for those that want to stick around. Okay, so let me, though, first of all, Howard, a comment and a question. The comment is that I just hadn't realized till you presented it, that sort of putting the two pieces together, the Gorton's no questions asked, and then note brokers, and those are completely antithetical. If you have note brokers, obviously people are going to be asking questions, and so that was just kind of an interesting juxtaposition there. Yeah. My question, though, has to do with your conclusion, because, okay, so obviously where I'm going to start is branch banking versus unit banking.
Okay.
And I thought that you were going to say that unit banking was costly because notes didn't travel more than 50 miles. But you've ended up with the opposite conclusion, which is kind of like notes didn't want to travel more than 50 miles. So I just wanted you to expand on what your results mean for the debate about unit banking and its costs, and just maybe pull that apart a little bit.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. So the region that I'm looking at, with the exception of Virginia, is they're all unit banking states. So, Virginia, as you know, is a branch banking state. I looked long and hard in Virginia records to try to come up to see if there was some kind of similar information that branches would keep tabs on the notes of being issued by other branches. I couldn't find it. Is unit banking costly? Of course it is, right? I mean, I would assume that the branch banks could solve the problem, could solve this distance problem more cheaply than unit banks could, right? Right. So, if it's a note that's issued on a branch in Lynchburg, Virginia, and it travels to Richmond, there should be zero. The no questions asked criteria is going to hold, and there should be a zero discount, right? Um, I would love to have that information. I don't have that information. It would be really interesting to see if those notes actually travel differently. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Very good.
I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it's still
I
kind of
get
out
it.
there, but it's just intriguing. Yeah. Thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah, I hadn't really thought about the sort of, thinking about this, put it in the context of the cost of unit banking. But that's an interesting point to make. Yeah, that's something I'll have to definitely think about a bit. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Chris Meisner has a question, and Chris, why don't you ask your own question? Unless he's moved on.
You may have moved on.
Okay, in which case I'll ask the question for you, and I'll just read his question. He says, "Thanks,
Yeah.
this is great." He wants to ask about other variables in the econometric models, like size, reputation of a bank, whether two banks are located along a main trade route. He'd prefer a model in the log of distance, and I'm
Okay.
sure you are squared. Well, thank you. Is the data set up as a full matrix where each bank pair enters the sample? And is that how you generated zeros? And I think yes, but go ahead.
To answer the questions, why don't I include other variables like size? Well, I already include circulation, capitalization, deposits, right? And all those things are highly correlated, right? So you have to have concerns about that. Reputation of the bank. I do in the model include the banknote discounts that are reported. I think that I put that in specifically to capture the reputation of the bank. I do include the joint, are they both, the trade routes capture whether they're both sitting on the same canal or the same river. So that's included in the model as well. And I think I have to go back and look. I think I do use the log of distance, although I'd have to double check that. I mean, I'm sure I ran this both logs and linear. But I'd have to go back and check that. But yeah, that's good. That's a good thing to address as well. Okay.
Okay, let me, Cedric has his hand up, which is almost like putting a question in the Q&A. But Cedric, why don't you go ahead and ask your question if you're there? Okay, while that's happening, why don't we let Richard Silla ask his question? So, Dick, where are you? Maybe, can you unmute yourself, Richard?
Yes, can you hear me?
I can.
Howie, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Dick. How are you?
Fine. I was wondering, it seems like most of your evidence in here is for I would say the 1837 to 1860 period.
Yes.
And you briefly mentioned the Bank of the United States, and I was wondering when the Bank of the United States was operating branches throughout the country, let's say from 1817 to 1836. If I wanted to travel, I might take my local banknotes and exchange them at the local branch of the Bank of the United States, and then presumably the bank BUS notes would be acceptable all over the country. Did that have any effect on how the system worked? Was it very different, do you think, before the 1837 when the Bank of the US was there?
I think it could have been. I'll put it that way. In the sense that, I mean, I don't recall what the denominational mix of second banknotes were, right? I mean, my recollection is that those were all pretty large denomination banknotes, $20 and above, right? And so they probably were more useful for long distance transactions than the privately issued currencies would have been. They would not have been particularly useful for these low level retail transactions as people are moving, you know, as they're just simply moving around on a day-to-day basis, right? I mean, that's one of the things that the state banks did, right, is that they filled these denominational voids that you know, with small denomination notes that replaced the relatively low quality currency, you know, coinage that's around. So I think, you know, the state banks are trying to do sort of service both markets, right? They're trying to facilitate retail trade by offering small denomination $1, $2, $5 notes and so forth. Whereas I think the second bank was mostly interested in larger denomination notes. I do know from reading various histories and running across anecdotes that second bank notes did travel substantial distances, unlike most of these private, small state bank notes that we're observing here. So the world probably was different during the period of the second bank of the United States. And I think that also goes to answering Angela's question about the benefits of branch versus unit banking, right? So if second bank notes facilitated trade that they didn't have to rely on inland bills of exchange that they could move with second bank notes, it may have been easier and less costly to do than to draw an inland bill of exchange and worry about how you're going to repay it through correspondent networks, right? So does that answer your question?
I think so. It sounds to me like the BUS notes could be like an old version of traveler's checks. You know, we used to buy traveler's checks when we go from one place to another,
Yeah.
and a BUS note, even if it was $20 or higher, you know, you could take it with you to Cincinnati, say from Philadelphia, and then exchange it for Cincinnati notes without any having to get any discount.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, there are lots of parallels between now and then, right? Because one of the things I mentioned in the paper is that these discounts are not unlike in the modern world the swipe fees that banks charge customers. They charge the vendors for using credit cards and debit cards, right? And so, you know, there are still discounts for for using alternative payment systems. So, I mean, they still exist today, which is kind of an interesting result, right? So. Okay.
Okay, maybe we'll move on to the next question. And Laura Burnett, if you're there, maybe you could ask your question, sort of thinking about English currencies relative to US.
Yeah, so thank you. It's a really fascinating paper. So to end the question, I'm working on private coinage in the 17th century England. It's a very different thing, but very similar kind of issues around what affects the circulation. The modeling we've done there, we see a much quicker drop off, around 20 miles rather than your 50. But what we do see is big differentiation there between issuers and location of issue in terms of the circulation. So certain locations have much larger circulation, certain issuers have much larger circulation. So two questions. To what extent might your bank data be non-representative of the circulating medium if people are preferentially depositing what they can't use as easily? So is that an issue with your bank data, perhaps? And how does that compare to your discounter? And secondly, obviously, when looking in the 17th century, there are very large issues of power dynamics is that the private currencies, if we expect them to be less liquid or less kind of preferred from the state coinages, there's a huge issue of power dynamics, and that who in transactions has the issue to refuse or demand certain currencies. And I wonder whether you see differentiations between banks and who they accept notes from. So might they be accepting at different rates notes from preferential customers who they in effect take that loss from because they're gaining other things from that transaction. So I think that for some of that social modeling, I'd be interested to see whether you've looked at.
Yeah. I can't, the question about preferential acceptance, I can't directly observe that because I don't observe refused notes, right? All I observed were the ones that they were actually holding, and it's the same. I mean, when I first got my hands on the banknote brokers ledger, my hope was that I could actually observe that, right? That he might have written down in his ledger that somebody tendered a note from this particular bank, and I just didn't take it. But he didn't. He only recorded the notes that he accepted and discounted. So I mean, the fancy term here is I have a selection issue problem, right? I'm only observing the ones that they selected to take, and then trying to draw something out of that. I mean, the econometric that I talked about, I kind of went through very quickly about using these zero inflated negative binomial models. I mean, the first stage is effectively trying to capture that, right? But it's going to be an imperfect way of doing it, right? But no, I mean, I would really like to see your work on what's happening with these 17th century private coinage as well, because that sounds like a really cool project. I think that would be great. So,
Like I said, it's good to hear
yeah.
similar work because it draws
Yeah.
parallels, and the fact you were so happily seeing the trade routes is
Yeah.
nice because it provides evidence that in the 17th century is drawing out those trade routes. But I suppose it's other sources, I suppose, is the question, that the less the banks and more the other sources, court source and so on, would they be more helpful in bringing out those things?
Yeah. Well, again, what I do observe is are they want? Yeah. So what I do observe is their interbank deposits. Okay. And so that gives me an indication of which banks at least they deal with on a regular basis, whether it's an indication of it's clearly not an indication of all the banks they might be willing to deal with. It's only ones that have some reason for holding these interbank deposits, which is probably being driven by movements of goods and movements of money. Right. And so, and I will say that there are in the data, especially for the Philadelphia banks, that there are lots of country banks that hold accounts with other banks that their notes do not show up. Right. And so, yeah, I would think that if they're holding an interbank account with a bank whose notes would show up, they would. I mean, part of what those accounts were for was note redemption. I mean, Warren Weber has a paper in the JEH 15 years ago that actually traced out these redemption accounts in the Pennsylvania market, and it wasn't the sole use of these interbank balances, but it was part of it, right? And so. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly. I have to think more about how this reflects on these sort of strategic nodes, if I want to call them that, the strategic zero problem. Okay. All right.
So, and Bill English had a very similar question, sort of, he has to go teach, but he had the same question about how then, who was refusing the notes. I guess though your answer did make me think about a little bit the due to and due from. And I just am always intrigued by those in bank balance sheets because they're always like a pain, right? Like, okay, what to do to, what to do from. But actually, there's a lot of information in them. And I wondered if I don't have any specific ideas, but I did wonder if you could do more with that information because you just have it sort of sitting there. But maybe it's got more information than the note stuff.
I could do more with, I'd never really thought about sort of mapping that out in a similar way. That would be fascinating. I should do that. I mean, I do include this in the regression to try to capture, the degree to which banks had ongoing relationships, and if the notes are moving in the same way that these accounts are being held, right? So I do try to account for that. But again, that's probably something I could do more with than I have. So I'll dig back into that and see what I can do with those numbers. No, but it is really interesting stuff, right? That why would they hold these interbank accounts? I mean, in the paper I actually trace out the Easton Bank, which sat at the confluence of 3 different canals, right? And so they're connected by canal to New York City, they're connected by a canal to Philadelphia, and they're connected by a canal to the coal fields of eastern Pennsylvania, and they're holding large accounts with all the banks sort of at the terminuses, the termini of those canals, right? So they're clearly interacting with banks with these trade flows, right? And so, and the accounts seem to be, the magnitude of the account seems to follow largely what we would expect to be the magnitude of the trade flows as well. So, yeah.
Okay, very nice.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to draw the formal proceedings to an end here and thank Howard for his paper. That was great. I have more questions, so I'm going to stick around for another 15 minutes to peruse this. But please, an invitation to all of you to stick around, and maybe also there'll be time for a bit more discussion about the econometrics, which went very quickly from my perspective. So, but let me, as I said, thank Howard for the paper. I also want to advertise the seminar that will happen 2 weeks from today, which has what I think of as a great paper, Canst Thou Beggar Thy Neighbor? Evidence from the 1930s, and Paul Buscas will present. Paul's from Sciences Po. And so yes, revisiting that old question about who did what in the 1930s with their exchange rate and what was the impact. So looking forward to that. But meanwhile, though, we're still here with Howard talking about a different time period, different country, I think. And so maybe we can keep going with the discussion of early American banknotes. And maybe I'll lead off that discussion, Howard, by asking you, excuse me, about sort of, I was actually surprised at the low value of the holdings that people had. I mean, there's masses of data and there's hundreds of banks in all these different places, but there weren't, I mean, actually not very much was there. So that's one thing, were you surprised at how little the amounts were? And then a related question is, you talk about a small time broker. So how big was a big time broker, and was actually the action happening in the brokerage market rather than in the banks? So 2 questions.
Yeah. Again, great questions that I can't answer. I have gone and looked to try. I mean, we have lists. I mean, when you look in the newspapers from the time, you can actually see the list of all the banknote brokers that are operating in Philadelphia or New York or wherever. As far as I have looked at, like, the Pennsylvania Historical Society and the University of Pennsylvania Library and so forth, and these records don't seem to have been preserved at all. I mean, this small-time broker in Connecticut, I mean, this is just one volume in a very large box full of family papers that somebody donated to the Harvard Library, right? It showed up by accident, and I happened to have an archivist that knew it was there and told me about it. Otherwise, that would still be, hadn't been used either, right? So now at Van Court, Bicknell, I mean, they were the 2 big brokers in Philadelphia that published these recorders. There's no, as far as I can tell, there's no information about how they actually operated their business. So
wow. Yeah, no, that's frustrating. Well, it's certainly a call out there to anybody digging around in merchant arc. I mean, I mean, a broker could be a specialized business, or it could be a sideline for a notary, a lawyer, a merchant. Is that right? Yeah. Or
so I'm pretty sure that this guy in Connecticut, the note brokerage business was a sideline. He ran a grocery, and so I think this was his sideline business. I think for the bigger brokers in the big cities, I think this was their principal business. So I read a biography of J.P. Morgan many years ago, and one of the partners that he took in early on had actually been a banknote broker in Philadelphia, and that he had started off as one of these small-time banknote brokers, and then he sort of transitioned from that into being a more general financier, right? Once he built up enough capital, he started making loans, and he started buying and reselling state and government bonds and so forth, right? So he transitioned from this very narrow business into a much wider business. Whether that is the standard trajectory, I don't know. I'm sure it's like anything else. I'm sure some of these guys are specialized, and some of them were probably weren't. Right? So
yeah. Yeah.
Um,
We have a question from George Perendia, and actually,
Okay.
George, if I can find you, I'll let you ask the question. So hopefully you're there and you can unmute and then ask your question. But failing that, I will. George, no. Please go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't think maybe it's a difficult line. So maybe
Actually, why don't I ask the question for you?
yeah, we're getting a lot of
So-
feedback or something. Yeah.
Yeah, so a lot of background noise there. Were there frequent cases of partially dollarized cities using remote notes for trade together with the local ones? So I think what you're getting at maybe is that a city might use, like a small town might use the notes of Pittsburgh banks, even though they had their own banks, but they were busy using the notes of a big bank in a different location. Is that? I'm not sure if I've quite got the question, but Howard, why don't you give it a shot?
Yeah, I think that's my kind of interpretation reading the question.
yes.
Yeah, I mean, I would suspect that would be true, right? And so, I mean, again, I think what would be going on is that places that didn't have their own banks. So again, the entire state of Pennsylvania had 42 banks. Okay. And like 15 of them are in Philadelphia, right? So there are lots of emerging market towns, if you will, that are not going to have their own bank. The question is, what did they use as currency? My suspicion is what they would use is it would be notes from banks that are reasonably proximate to where they are, right? Again, because I mean, they might have been using Philadelphia notes or they might have been using Pittsburgh notes, depending on which city they were closer to. But again, you would think that whatever notes had the lowest verification and transactions costs would be the notes that would get used in those kinds of local markets, right? So if you trusted certain Philadelphia banks, my suspicion is that those Philadelphia banknotes would flow into that community and be used for local transactions within that community, right? I mean, I can't demonstrate that, but that's kind of the economic intuition I would have about answering the question.
Let me turn to a different subject, and I did look at the paper, but I can't remember. State fixed effects. I just wondered whether you make the point about the State Bank of Illinois, I think it is, that's not a good bank. And I wondered whether the different regulatory environments in different states would have affected that would show up, I think, in state fixed effects. But I wondered, do you observe any? Are there significant state fixed effects?
Yeah. Do I use state fixed effects? I'm looking rapidly for my tables here to see if whether I did include. No, I used bank fixed effects. I don't think I used.
Oh, okay. Well,
I didn't use state fixed effects because my suspicion there's something else in the data that if you use state fixed effects, it washes out everything else. I think I don't remember what it would be.
okay. I mean, I was it was mostly about whether different regulatory environments, you'd said, okay, no one's touching notes from Illinois, period, or no one's touching notes from Connecticut or something.
Yeah. I think, I mean, the biggest regulatory difference I see across these states would be Ohio and Virginia. So again, previous discussion, Virginia had branch banking rather than unit banking. The notes they're largely observing are not from Richmond or Norfolk. They're mostly from Wheeling, and they're moving along the Ohio River. Ohio had a sort of odd regulatory system as well, too, right? Where they had these banks that all became jointly liable for each other. But New York had a unit banking system that looked a lot like Pennsylvania's, operated the same way Delaware, New Jersey. So these are relatively similar types of regulatory systems.
Yeah.
Right? So
yeah. Okay, I think we're coming to the end, but Rui has a question, and Rui is somewhere that I can't even pronounce. So he asked if I would, but somewhere noisy. And his question had to do with the symmetry between discounts. So going back to discounts, were the discounts a Philadelphia note discounted in Baltimore, was it the same as the Baltimore, same bank, Baltimore to Philadelphia, which would mean that it was more about the distance and the trade costs between two banks than about informational asymmetries.
I'd have to answer that question accurately, I'd have to go back and look. My sense is that the discounts are, if they're not the same, they're very close and they're all very low, right? So again, so if you're in Baltimore and you have Philadelphia, if you have Philadelphia banknotes, the discount's going to be well less than 1%. It's probably going to be 1/4 of 1%. My suspicion is that the Baltimore notes in Philadelphia would look about the same. Top of my head, I'm thinking about 1/2 of 1% discount. I mean, so those kinds of, inner city discounts are going to be very, very low.
Okay. Yeah.
So, I mean, it's almost going to be purely just simply the cost of getting them back there, right? The risk is there's going to be a relatively low risk component to those banknote prices. Yeah, but I could definitely look at that. So, but yeah, look at the symmetry of these banknote prices.
Okay, well, believe it or not, I think you've answered all my questions and possibly all the questions of the attendees. So I think that we will wrap it up, and I'll again say thank you.
Okay.
It's
Well,
great.
thank you. I'll thank Rui for the invitation. It was a pleasure to do this. It's been a long time since I did a Zoom seminar. I've been trying to avoid them after all those years of being forced to do Zoom seminars and classes, and so. But this was nice. Thank you.
Thank you, Howard.
Thank you.
Thank you, Angie, for moderating. And
All good.
See you all
Okay.
a couple of weeks.
All right. Thank you.
Very good. A reminder, yes, in a couple of weeks that we'll be talking about competitive exchange rates or not. So
Okay.
thanks
All right,
very much.
thanks. Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you.
bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.